Can everyone hear? Yeah. I don't usually use microphones, I use voice projection, so this is a little weird for me. We'll make sure this works. Okay, so just like you heard, I have been a park ranger, a seasonal park ranger for the National Park Service for about 10 years actually, and I also interned out at Utah at Arches and up north near Pictured Rocks. And this may be the last talk I give for the Nature Society for a while, probably will be, because I'm going to be moving out permanently, well, kind of permanently, it's really hard to tell with the Park Service, out to New Mexico to Gila Cliff Dwellings National Monument. So that'll give you something to look up when you get home. But in the more local vein, this is when I worked at Sleeping Bear Dunes, the only time I have ever been paid to work at a park in Michigan. It was very nice. It was very different because usually I'm somewhere very far away. And I really enjoyed living in Michigan for the summer because, as it turns out, it's one of the most beautiful places I have ever worked. And it's my goal ultimately to come back and work here. I just don't know how long that'll take. This will be kind of a travel log. So if you have in-depth questions about geology or plants or history, I will be happy to take those questions afterward. But this is more of an overview for those of you who have not been to the park, which reminds me, how many of you have been to Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore? That makes sense because you're nature people. That is great.
Ask us how many times.
How many times? How many?
5 or 6.
All right. Yeah. Cool. All right, so how many of you have been there more than once? All right, you make sure I get everything right. I was there for about 5 months. So most people, believe it or not, that visit the park, yourselves accepted, do not realize that it is a national park. I can say this for certain because the most frequent question I got was, so this is a state park, right? Where do I pay my state fee? Or, I have the state park pass on my license plate. That gets me in, right? That was always fun to answer because the answer is no, which is not popular. It is a national lakeshore, which is the equivalent of a national seashore like Cape Hatteras. And it was before that, it was not a state park. It was actually a collection of local reserves. So I called it our hidden gem, although you have all found that hidden gem, because for the majority of people, they actually don't know it's there, or they don't know it's a national park. Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore, that's the visitor center, is a beautiful place, of course, because of its amazing sand dunes. But it also has, apparently, one of the 21 best beaches in the world, according to National Geographic Travel. And it's right up there with beaches that are in the Caribbean. So I guess it depends what you like, but they put it up there with the 21 top places for beaches. It also was rated back in 2012 one of the most beautiful places in America by Good Morning America. Now, you wouldn't think this was such a big deal, but Good Morning America has to be way more popular than I thought it was because apparently the visitation after this came out doubled. Because people suddenly said, wait, that exists? And then they all came to visit. We also are going to be this year having a priority mail stamp for Sleeping Bear Dunes. So if you want to buy a $25 stamp, it will be available later this year. I don't know that I'm going to be indulging in this pastime, but if you're a stamp collector, there it is. So Sleeping Bear Dunes is so beautiful and so amazing because of its location out on a peninsula, the Leelanau Peninsula, that was created by glacial erosion of limestone. And basically what that means is you get a whole lot of sand in one place that was deposited by those glaciers and then blown up on top of the rocks that the glaciers also left behind. It also has these two islands included in the park, North Manitou and South Manitou. Has anyone been to one of those islands? Impressive. How many have been to North Manitou? Very good. Actually, I have to admit, I did not get out to North Manitou. And that's because it's actually kind of an ordeal. You have to be willing to get the permit, you have to be willing to camp, and I never got enough time off to actually make it worth going out there. But if I were to go back, that would be the first thing I did. But South Manitou is really beautiful as well, of course. Yeah, beautiful flowers. So there's a zoom of our dune area, and you can see that it actually isn't that big. The dunes themselves are only a little piece of the park. That's the bit along the coastline. But the more inland portions are actually forested. And so a lot of folks that visited the park when I worked there were not aware that the forested parts were also part of the park and that there were trails to hike. Because to many people, the park is just for swimming because it's one of the 21 best beaches. And they would just swim and leave, which is a shame. See, and part of that story goes back to the reason why all of these Native American tribes, the Ottawa and the Potawatomi to some extent, and largely the Ojibwa, spent time in that area as, well, as their summer fishing and hunting. Because does that sound like something people still do in that area today? Summer fishing and hunting camp? Same exact reasons. Because you don't necessarily want to be there in the winter. But in the summer, it's a great and bountiful place to store up for your winter stocks, or today, just a fun place to go fishing. And those tribes, collectively called the Anishinaabe, they, or the people of the Three Fires, they have the story that gave the park its name. So if you haven't heard it, here's the quick version. There were 3 bears, and 2 of them were cubs. There was a mother bear and her 2 cubs. They lived in Wisconsin on the other side of Lake Michigan. And there was a horrible fire. So these bears, their loving mother who was so attached to the cubs, they had to swim all the way across Lake Michigan to get away from this forest fire. As the fire approached them, many of the animals fled into the lake, but only the stronger animals, like the bears, were able to keep swimming. And they kept swimming and swimming, desperate to reach the shore. As they swam, the mother bear kept poking at the cubs and prodding them with her snout, trying to make sure that they would stay above the fierce waves of the lake. And the farther they got from land, the more tired the cubs grew, despite the best efforts of the mother bear to keep them going. In the end, those 2 cubs drowned close to the shore, just before reaching their goal. The mother bear sat up on a hill waiting for the cubs to come out of the water, hoping that they hadn't drowned, that someday they would come out and join her again. And eventually she stayed there until she was covered with snow in the winter, sand in the summer. The Great Spirit, Gitche Manitou, took pity upon the mother bear and saw that her loyalty was something that should be honored. So he transformed the mother bear into a great sand dune, which today is called the Sleeping Bear Dune, for the place where that mother bear fell asleep waiting for her cubs. And he raised the 2 bear cubs out of the lake as 2 islands, North and South Manitou, so that they will remain always in view of that mother bear, and they can be together for eternity. And yeah, it is a good story. And that's why it's actually been passed down for many hundreds of years. And it's a good, sad story. But it is a powerful reminder that this is also an important place, a sacred place to the Anishinaabe. And they have partnered with the Park Service to help protect this land. Now this land that the bears swam to across this lake, it was a pretty long swim, is a narrow peninsula. Some people call it the little finger on the mitten. And this is the Leelanau Peninsula up here. There's another peninsula in there, the Mission Peninsula. And when you zoom in, you can see the small area that is the park. These darker green areas, or I guess that's a lighter green, that is the wilderness area is. Back in, I believe it was the year before I worked there, so I think it was some point in 2015, it was designated as federal wilderness. And today we think of wilderness as being something like, say, out at Yellowstone or Mount Rainier. But at Yellowstone, there is no federally designated wilderness inside that park. It is maintained as wilderness, but it's not federally designated. And here at an area which has a lot of development nearby, there is federal wilderness. And that's because there are no roads in those areas, there are no actively maintained trails. You may walk in that area, but you can't take any motorized equipment or any power tools. And it is to be maintained as a wilderness, largely because that helps to protect the fragile dune ecosystems, which the biggest threat to dunes is humans, but not because they're walking on it, but because of people building on it. And this means that even though it's within a park and technically is protected, it's double protected by designating it a federal wilderness as well. And this guy, Senator Philip Hart, I can see some of you were going to say it for me. Yeah, he was the person who was instrumental in getting this park created. Without him, it is likely we wouldn't have had the park. It was considered really controversial because the good citizens of Leelanau and Benzie counties saw themselves as being the stewards of the land and didn't want it to be overrun by tourists like they saw many national parks had been. And they didn't want the government to take over the land. And the trouble with that, while I agree that they were being good stewards, is that ultimately money talks. And the longer that land sat there, the more valuable it got, and the more Lakeshore was being developed in ways that made it not accessible to the general public. And so seeing that development, and with Philip Hart acting as the intermediary, because he was respected by both Republicans and Democrats as a long-term member of the Senate they saw as being responsible, he was able to broker negotiations between the homeowners and the federal government. And in the end, many residents were able to stay. They were not forced off their land, but they were not able to pass that land on to their children or grandchildren. Some others did choose to just sell the land outright to the government and move somewhere else, but that was their choice. And in doing so, it has been protected so that people can still see it in a more pristine state. It's unlikely that it would have gone undeveloped for very long. This particular building is the Philip Hart Visitor Center. And it looks sort of like a Western fort. It was, I think, intended to look like a lighthouse. And it was originally built as a visitor center for the county, or the city of Empire rather, and not for the Park Service. And you were supposed to be able to climb up into the top and get a view out of the top, and that's why they built it like that. And then the fire marshal came in and said something like, no, you can't have people go up there, that is not safe. And so they were never able to use it. And so today it just is for decoration. Very iconic looking. And it was created in and around 1970, which is when the park was designated. It was signed into law by Richard Nixon. So this park was created by a president who actually passed a lot of environmental laws and parks, not necessarily because they were his idea, but some of them were. And today we are enjoying the fact that this was set aside. I know all of you guys are. So, all right, we already looked at that map, but you can see, the reason I brought this up again was just because you can see that there are some trails through here. Most of them are pretty small, actually. The majority of trails are between 1 to 3 miles long. So it's not like at Mount Rainier or Yellowstone where you go on a 30-mile trail. But what makes it really fascinating is that on one of those 3-mile trails, you're going to go from one type of ecosystem, a beach ecosystem, swale, all the way into a beech maple forest. That's B-E-E-C-H, beech tree. So you're going to be able to see 2 different kinds of beaches. There are lots of both. Now, this is the view of the dune from above. And it surprises many people that are not from Michigan to see, first of all, how much water we have, and second of all, to see that this kind of dune exists in the Midwest. It just doesn't really look like something you would find. It is not your usual small beach dune. The dunes you're probably, those people anyway, are probably thinking of are parabolic dunes, and they're much smaller and they happen near the beach level from the sand getting blown and then running up against something like a little plant or a little tree and eventually forming kind of a sand hill. Here, because the glaciers had already left a moraine, so basically a pile of rocks left behind by a melting glacier, that is a big bluff. And the big sandstone and limestone accumulation in that area breaks down with the wind, and then the sand, the lightest, most small grains of sand, blow up and over the top of that moraine and make it into a perched dune, and thus called because it's perched, or like sitting on top of the rocks. And that's what makes the sand so fine, that it makes that singing noise when you walk on it, because it's only the lightest grains of sand that get blown onto the dunes. And you can even see those dunes from satellite images as sort of a glowing white spot. So they are visible from space if you know what you're looking for. And here's some of those different kinds of dunes. Perch dunes are actually the most rare kind of sand dune in the world. So one reason it was set aside is that the perched dune ecosystem is really unusual anywhere on Earth, let alone in Michigan. Although there are some other perched dunes on in the Upper Peninsula and in the Grand Sable area, and then also they're going to be on the islands, Manitou Islands. So the ecosystem, in brief, is that you have, I couldn't find one specifically for perch dunes, and I was not in the mood to draw my own beach diagram. So just keep in mind that a perch dune would be taller and farther away from the lake than this. But it's basically the same in that you'll still have the foredune where you have the dry beach, all of the wind is blowing here, and it's going to be a very hostile environment for plants. Then you have this area, which is slightly protected, and many times it is called swale, and is protected from the wind. So you can have plants, you can even have water accumulating there. And then eventually you'll get to the rear dune, which is where it will become forested, because the dune itself becomes a barrier to the wind and plants can thrive. This is not a healthy dune. Does anyone know what that is a picture of? What do people usually do in this part of Squeaky Bear Dunes? You've all been there, you know what this is. Yeah, this is the dune line. In fact, it is called the dune line. It's on the side. But the dune line really shouldn't look like this. It looks like this because it's been used as a dune line since way before it ever became a national lakeshore. It's been used as a dune line since at least the 1920s. So, when the Park Service got it, they decided, well, this is kind of like the sacrificial dune. Like, there's nothing we can do about it. Let's just leave it and have people ruin this one. And it's a lot of fun. I hate to say that, because I know as an ecologist, I'm supposed to say, oh, that's bad, you're killing plants. But it is fun to climb up. You can see why people have been doing it. But we're hoping to limit it to that area. And because it has been basically deforested due to all the people destabilizing the sand, it moves about 4 feet a year, which doesn't sound like much, but it has eaten the parking lot multiple times. They keep building new parking lots. And if you look at pictures from the 1970s, that's a different parking lot than the one that's there now, because the dune now is over the old parking lot. And usually dunes only move about 2 feet a year. This one was of this one tree that you can see slowly being covered by the dune until there's only these little branches sticking out of the top. And this moves more than your average dune would. And it does take quite a while to climb up, especially if you're not a small child. And less time to run down, especially if you are a small child. But if you want to see dunes that still have their vegetation that they're really supposed to have, you can go on the Cottonwood Trail, which is an interpretive trail about 1.5 miles long that the rangers will take people on as a guided tour to show them the dune ecosystem. And you can see that there are a lot of, well, what kind of trees do you based on that name? Cottonwoods. Yeah, they are, in fact, cottonwoods. And some of them are balsam, but the majority are cottonwood. They happen to grow there along with the marrow grass, which is the most common grass. And them help to stabilize the dunes with their root system. In places where it's been blown away, in areas called blowouts, appropriately enough, you can see the roots exposed. And one of the things we love to show the kids on these hikes, we'll take school kids, school groups on them, is that, well, look at where the trail is. Look at where the blowouts are. Where are the most blowouts? And they're right along the place that everyone walks, because where you walk, there aren't any plants anymore. And the blowouts expose the infrastructure, if you will. So when those plants die, it's like the frame of the building has been taken away. There's no stability, and it means that it will fall apart. You can see in this close-up that the grains of sand are really holding together because of the roots, in this case, of the grasses. But other plants help with that too. This is sand cherry, which is actually a cherry, and it does have edible cherries, although they're not very sweet. Birds like them more than people. And then this is bearberry, which is edible, but that's all you can say for it. And then this is creeping juniper, but it's creeping because it sort of crawls along the ground. It doesn't grow like a juniper shrub normally would. Instead, it sort of grows by runners along the ground, more like a vine. And if you try to lift it up like the branch of a tree, it'll be stuck firmly to the ground. So it really is one of the stabilizing agents. And the birds like to eat the juniper berries. The cottonwood, though, is probably the most unique in that not only can it survive being buried in the sand, which most trees can't, but the reason it can survive being buried in the sand, and that's because as it gets buried, the branches that get buried, they actually start to transform. Long enough, the branches turn into roots. It'd be like if you walked on your hands for a really long time and then they turned into feet. It's kind of unusual, but they are able to transform in that manner, which allows them to continue to survive even when the root level changes for the trees. Oaks can survive somewhat, and so can balsam poplars, but the cottonwoods thrive the most. And then eventually, if the dunes get stabilized, then they can turn into forests. And Alligator Hill, which is in the picture, but you can't see the alligator shape exactly. Alligator Hill is a hiking area which has sort of the shape of an alligator if looked at from out in the bay. And it had a lot of damage during a windstorm, which happened in 2015, the year before I worked at Sleeping Bear. So if any of you heard about the windstorm, it was not a tornado, which a lot of people think. It was actually just 3 thunderstorms that came through in quick succession and had over 100-mile-an-hour winds. And it traveled over a 25-mile area, that's it. So it was kind of almost like a straight line wind, except it was technically 3 thunderstorms that were rotating slightly, so they acted a little bit like a tornado. And when you put the two things together, you get a lot of what people are saying is devastation. A lot of the hiking trails were closed that year, the bicycle path was closed, and the Friends of Sleeping Bear, a group much like ours, was helping to open the trails again. And today they're all open, and you can see the area fixing itself because it's a natural occurrence. And that allows more wildflowers to grow in those areas where the trees have come down. Although folks still have to say, it looks so messy, why don't you clean up the dead trees? And that's because we want them to go back into the soil. It's what they're supposed to do. But it does look a little messy, so if you go down here, you'll be aware there are dead trees. But they will grow back. And in other areas, the trees lower down were not damaged by the storm, so there's still plenty of places you can see those beech maple forests. Of course, beech maple. And this is one of them in the Schneider area. Schneider Hill is a popular cross-country ski trail in the winter. In the summer, it's a beautiful trail that not very many people hike because it doesn't go to the lake, so it's not popular. But if you want to go through a beautiful forest and not see the lake, I recommend this one. And in the spring, Schneider Hill is a great place to see flowers like Solomon seal and bellwort, and of course all of the trillium. And there's lots of trillium there. With erosion is partly because those plants are trampled by walking feet, and partly because it wasn't just walking feet that used to trample them. Between 1938 and 1978, there were dunesmobile rides. Did any of you take a dunesmobile ride at Sleeping Bear Dunes? I bet it was fun, right?
It's like hard.
Yeah. No, I went on the one at Silver Lake Sand Dunes as a kid, the Macwoods Dune Ride, and I loved it. So there's a good reason why these were so popular. It's a lot of fun, you see the lake, and it doesn't look like it's doing any damage because you're just driving around in the sand. And it wasn't understood at the time that cars do damage the roots of those plants. So the dunesmobile ride continued until Marion Warnes, the woman who owned the operation, the granddaughter of the person who had started it in 1938, retired. And then it was purchased by the National Park Service and closed down. And I know this sounds sad, but you can still go to the Macwoods Dune rides and experience the same thing, but you cannot do it in the National Lakeshore any longer. And there's a pretty good reason for that. This is the Sleeping Bear. This is in 1908. You can actually see the bear's ear and the bear's back where she fell asleep looking out over the water waiting for her cubs. This is actually a little knoll where there were some trees growing. But then this picture is from 1988. And you can see that the bear's ears are gone, the bear's head is kind of gone. It doesn't look very much like a bear at all. Today it looks even less like a bear than it did then. And it's mostly because of the damage done by those dunesmobile rides that actually were going up and over the bear. So the actual sleeping bear doesn't look a whole lot like a bear anymore. And there are other threats to the park, largely ones you'd be familiar with, invasive species. Garlic mustard is there, but it's actually a newcomer. It's a pretty recent invasive plant there. The one that is a lot worse is one that we don't have a problem with in this area of Michigan. And this is a familiar plant that is used in bouquets, often as a dried plant. Baby's breath, yep, knew someone would get it. And much like a lot of other invasive plants, it outcompetes by having seeds that you cannot get rid of. When these plants die, even if you cut them down at the roots, and if you don't take them and get rid of them and get them far, far away from the dunes, they will roll like tumbleweed. And they will spread their seeds everywhere. And what happens is that, ironically perhaps, they overstabilize the dune. They actually hold it in place so well that plants that rely on having a slightly shifting environment, like the endemic pitcher's thistle, which is an endangered plant, they can't grow there anymore because this plant has outcompeted them and is holding the sand together too much. It also takes up too much water. It takes water away from the native plants. They have these huge taproots, and this doesn't even quite do it justice. The taproots are even bigger than that. This is only part of it. So these things can be as thick as your arm, and trying to pull them out is really difficult. So once it gets established, it's pretty difficult to do anything about it. And This is the pitcher's thistle, exactly. Yeah, this is the one that we're trying to protect at the park because it is an endemic species. That means it only grows in this place. And it is an endangered plant because it only grows in that place. So one of the threats is human traffic, and the other threat is invasive plants, mostly the baby's breath, but others too, like the spotted knapweed. We're all familiar with that one if you're a Nature Society member. And it's pretty awful no matter where you go, unless you go to wherever it belongs. But what it's doing here is over-stabilizing the beaches. And that is bad for, oh, you can't see my bird. That is bad for the piping plover, which is specifically the Great Lakes piping plover, which is it's important because it's an endangered species anyway, but the Great Lakes piping plover, there's like almost none of them. Literally half of the population as of the last count in 2017 was in Sleeping Bear Dunes when they nested. Half of the nesting pairs were in Sleeping Bear Dunes. So it's pretty important to protect them, and they need to have some of that movement to have their nest be successful. So the people walking along the beach scare them. Dogs especially freak them out. And then we have the spotted knapweed that's changing the ecology. But because of that, there is actually a program called the Bark Ranger program. And you can make your dog an official bark ranger. This is real. The dog will actually earn badges. And to show that you are controlling the dog and it's a well-behaved dog and it will not chase any plovers. So if you take your dog, maybe you can get some dog badges. You can even get a little sash to put on the dog's neck. Of course, there are other aquatic invasive species out in the water, which isn't so much the focus of this program, but the goby, the zebra mussel, spiny water flea, all of our friends, the Asian carp, of course, which we hope isn't there, and of course the lamprey. The one that's the biggest threat to Sleeping Bear Dunes, though, is actually the zebra mussel. And this is going to come as a shock. But who loves that incredibly clear water at Sleeping Bear Dunes? How beautiful it is, and you can see straight to the bottom. I bet you all love that. You just don't want to raise your hands because you know that there's a trick here. And the trick is that it's not supposed to be that clear. It's actually because the zebra mussels over-filter the water, and they take out not just bad stuff like pollution, but good stuff like the algae that needs to be eaten by other animals, and the phytoplankton that are supposed to create some shadow in the water. Without that, the sunlight goes straight into the water and is the best thing ever for the cladophora, which is basically another kind of algae. But what happens is it just explodes and grows so much that it makes big floating mats that then die, sink to the bottom, get eaten by the round gobies, which then get eaten by shorebirds, which then die from botulism. It's a kind of a long process, but if you want to hear it again later, I'll tell you. Yeah, there are a lot of threats. Luckily, there are also a lot of people helping to protect the park and helping to alleviate these problems. And it is still an amazingly beautiful place to visit. And there's a lot to do there. Inquiring bears want to know, what do we do at Sleeping Bear Dunes? We do not just sleep. You can go to Glen Haven Historic Village. I'm starting with history for a good and personal reason. This historic house, which used to belong to entrepreneur D.H. Day, is today one of many historic homes in the Glen Haven Historic District, which preserves one of the only basically a seafaring village, or lakefaring, I guess, village that is still preserved in its original state. And I lived in that house. So you can go see the house I lived in. That makes it even more special. So I've never lived in a house with its own historic sign before. But it's an amazing place to visit, even if you don't live there. And Glen Haven was started by D.H. Day, who bought the whole town and ran it as a wooding station, meaning they would sell cordwood cut from the local area so that these big steamships that were still plying the waters at that time could pick up fuel. And it was sort of like a gas station. You just stopped to pick up some wood. And big steamships full of passengers would sometimes dock there and then come and want something to do. And so eventually there was an inn and a blacksmith shop and a store. And eventually people got jobs living there and it became an operating active village. Of course, they did have a sawmill. And anybody that worked at the sawmill, they would take their wood on these tracks down to the mill from the forest. He actually had, later he had a little train that ran on those tracks and it went right through the middle. And later on that train was used at Cedar Point Amusement Park. And I keep wondering if I ever saw the train when it was still there, and I have no idea, but it used to be in Glen Haven. And they had a boarding house for the employees of the sawmill. And here's the best part, D.H. Day, who was a clever businessman, he also owned the general store, and guess what everyone who worked for the sawmill got paid in? It's called scrip, which means it's not real money, you can only spend it at the general store. So it was pretty self-sustaining. But the good thing about D.H. Day is that, he was a good businessman. Yes, he paid people in scrip, but to be honest, there wasn't really a whole lot of other places to go, so I'm not sure it made a whole lot of difference. And the thing is, he actually was pretty pioneering for his time. Here it is today, it looks the same, which is pretty neat. He was pretty pioneering for his time. He saw that lumbering eventually wouldn't really work out as a sustainable thing. So he started a sustainable forestry program, one of the very first documented anywhere, where he planted young trees to replace the trees that were being cut down. And so he kept his lumbering operation going at least a few decades after most of the other ones had gone. And he also started a canning company for fruit because it was recognized that the sandy soil, once the trees are cut down, isn't good for a whole lot except growing fruit trees, which is why the Traverse City area today is famous for cherries, because the whole area was logged over during the 1800s and early 1900s, and then became cherry orchards and apple orchards. He also actually kept his forest, even after the lumbering stopped, as a forest reserve, because he said he'd like to watch the trees grow. So in his old age, he decided that he was going to be a forester who created a big park. And it eventually became the D.H. Day Campground, or actually the D.H. Day State Park, which then became a campground when it became a national park. So most of Sleeping Bear Dunes was not actually a state park. Only this little tiny area was, but it was one of the very first state parks. And now you can go visit it as a campground and even camp in it. Also in Glen Haven, you can go to the Glen Haven Historic Maritime Area, where the Coast Guard station was. Although, technically speaking, the Coast Guard station used to be way up on Sleeping Bear Point on a big sand dune. Now remember I said most sand dunes move about 2 feet a year. This was on a point on the top of a bluff, the very highest point, where the most wind was blowing, so that they could look out over the Manitou Passage. What do you think eventually happened to the Coast Guard station? It got covered up by sand. And if it hadn't, it wouldn't eventually fall into the lake, because that area has fallen into the lake at least twice. So it is still under there somewhere. It really is. I went out there and looked for it and I couldn't find it, but they say that the tower and the phone poles are still buried there. But this building got moved. They actually rolled those buildings on big log rollers down to the Glen Haven area in 1930. And that's where they still are today. So it started as a U.S. Life Saving Service station. And then in 1915, the U.S. Life Saving Service became part of the U.S. Coast Guard. And the reason it was so important to have that station there is because this area, the Manitou Passage, is actually one of the most dangerous in the Great Lakes. You always hear everything about Lake Superior, and part of that is because of the Edmund Fitzgerald. But there are so many shipwrecks in this area, many of which have not been discovered yet. 16 that are identified, at least 42 that are not identified, and probably hundreds that haven't been found in the general area. And that's because it was kind of like a trap. People wanted to go through here as they were trying to go up to the Straits of Mackinac, coming up from Ohio, going up through the Straits of Mackinac, or going the opposite way. And they wanted to get to this nice, safe harbor, one of these, the Glen Haven Harbor, or one of the other harbors like Good Harbor up here, or down here in the old ghost town of Errol. The most popular was Glen Haven. But in order to get to that safe harbor, you have to go through one of the most dangerous and treacherous areas in the Great Lakes. So it's like a toss-up. And it was dangerous because all of these shoals, these islands, the bear cubs, they are full of very rocky, pointy, tall shoals underwater that you cannot see. And there's a very specific path right here that you have to follow to not hit into them, especially with a larger vessel. And if you get off course just a little bit, you might end up on one of those shoals. Now, yeah, you're pretty close to land, but in this area, you would have storms that would toss up waves that could be over 2 stories tall. Fresh water is less dense than seawater, and so storms in the Great Lakes are actually worse, according to many mariners, than storms in the ocean, because the lack of density in the water makes the waves taller. And because the lake is narrow, especially Lake Michigan, imagine having a tub of water and you're sloshing it back and forth, and you know how the water gets bigger and bigger waves in it until eventually it slops out of the bucket? That's basically what's going on in Lake Michigan. There's an action of the waves where the waves just get bigger and bigger going back and forth across the narrow lake until it becomes just as dangerous as Lake Superior is reckoned to be. So that life-saving service post was very important, and they saved many lives there. Today, you can go, if you are certified as a scuba diver, of course, you can go scuba diving. I did not take this picture. You can go scuba diving down to the wrecks. It is actually a maritime preserve. It's considered to be part of the park, so they are protected too. Don't take anything from those shipwrecks when you go. Okay, all right, so this is the U.S. Coast Guard station right there, and today it's a maritime museum. And you can learn about how the U.S. Life-Saving Service went out in some of those waves that are 2 stories tall in little boats, which of course was not their preferred way to rescue people because it's pretty dangerous to take out a boat, even a self-bailing one, in water that rough. And you're not going to have nice, calm water if there's a shipwreck. If there's a shipwreck, it's because something's going on. So it was not their first choice. Their first choice was not to use these boats in the boathouse, which of course you can still visit today, but was to use the Lyle gun. Now, the Lyle gun, if you are not familiar with it, is the first and only cannon created by the Army in order to save lives rather than take them. And it was created specifically to save people from shipwrecks. There is a projectile that weighs about 20 pounds that's loaded into a small cannon, and the projectile itself is attached to a bunch of line in what's called a faking box, where the line is kind of braided together so it doesn't tangle, and then shot out of the cannon so that this projectile shoots over the deck of the ship, and then some guy on the ship has to haul the rope up. And then they set up a complex series of rigging, oh, there it is, called the breeches buoy or beach apparatus. And what they would do is actually haul this ridiculously heavy cart all the way down the beach. It actually weighed about 1,000 pounds when it was full. It was not pulled by horses usually, because usually there weren't any available. And occasionally they were able, in some circumstances, to get the cart pulled by horses. Usually the life-saving service pulled it out by pure manpower along the beach. These folks at first were volunteers. Eventually they got paid, but at first they were all volunteer. And then they would use the cannon to shoot it out to the ship so that they could haul a heavier line out to the ship on the first line and then do a complicated back and forth maneuver so that folks could get hauled out of ships in life rings. And the reason it's called a breeches buoy is it's basically a pair of pants sewn to a life ring. Now, if you can imagine being someone in a sinking ship with waves that could be 2 stories tall, getting loaded into a pair of pants in a life ring, I can't imagine that would be very much fun. But it was how they would haul you back to the shore. And by all accounts, this was actually very safe. There are no accounts of people falling out of it. I'm not saying it never happened, but maybe they just didn't write about it. But it seems to have worked pretty well. Today, the Park Service puts on demonstrations with children where you can have your kids volunteer to be the crew of the life-saving service. And hopefully they'll even keep their pants on, but this kid did not. And they will then enact putting up the beach apparatus, like this guy right there. And then they will haul a Raggedy Ann doll back and forth in a small breeches buoy. And then they can earn their Junior Ranger badge. Very important. But if you'd rather, you can actually, on Thursdays, see the actual Lyle gun being fired. This was during training, and I actually got to fire the cannon. It was really exciting. Usually, it's somebody in uniform firing the cannon. But this is the real Lyle gun, and it's the only place in the country you can actually see a Lyle gun being fired over water with the projectile. So it's a pretty special thing to be able to see, and then you can even help haul it back in if you want to. Now, if you've had your fill of U.S. Life-Saving Service history, you might want to go and see some of the history and nature over on the Manitou Islands. And for that, you would take the Mishimoqua, which, by the way, means Great Bear, over to the islands. And we'll stop at South Manitou first and then north, generally. Now, this is South Manitou Island, and this is the famous lighthouse there. So if you're a lighthouse person, you might want to take the boat just to see the lighthouse. You don't necessarily need to hike around the island. You can even just stay on the boat, look at the lighthouse, and then go back if you don't want to get off. And when you do get off, this probably looks familiar because it looks exactly like the other thing I was just showing you. It is the matching U.S. Life-Saving Service station on the island because guess what? It's on the other side of the same dangerous strait. There also are a lot of old abandoned farms on the island. It was actually settled before the mainland because this was originally the place where they were selling wood for the steamships before they started Glenhaven. So eventually people settled there and started farms, and in time most of them moved to the mainland and started farms there instead. But some of these farms were still active just back in the 1940s or 50s. And you can walk around the ruins of these old farms and imagine what they used to be like. You can see the old cemetery there, including this gravestone of one of the light keepers of the lighthouse. And there is also a forest there of ancient white cedars, some of which were 500 years old, and they were never logged. It was a very difficult area to get to. That's usually the reason why trees get saved in the late 1800s, because people just couldn't get to them and it wasn't worth it. It wasn't necessarily because they were like, hey, let's save those trees. But luckily for us, they are still there, and you can go and see them. You can also find my personal favorite thing on the island, giant millipedes. It's not a whole lot of other people's favorite thing, but it's mine.
Isn't one of the General Sherman is the name they gave the one I think is still out about the years?
It did, yeah. The oldest tree there did fall down. You can still see it, but it's actually laying on the ground. You're right. So you can, you can actually take kind of a little tour. It's like a tractor train, and it will take you out to the forest. And then from there, you can go back and go to the maritime area if you want to. So you can do all of that on their little tractor train instead of hiking. Of course, it's a wonderful place to hike. You can walk up to the lighthouse pretty easily. You can get a tour of it if you're there at the right time. And it's pretty amazing. It was built in 1858. It still looks fantastic. And it's being kept up by the Park Service now. but originally it was kept up by a volunteer group. And you can go up inside the lighthouse and get a fantastic view out toward the lake. Back on the mainland, you can do the Pierce Stocking Scenic Drive, always popular. It's a 7-mile loop drive, which actually was started by a guy named, coincidentally, Pierce Stocking. And he owned the land. He was another forester that decided that he really liked trees. And after he had spent his life in the lumber industry, decided to protect this area he owned and set it up as a scenic drive. And when the Park Service bought the land, they were able to acquire this later on. It was after Pierce Stocking died, they acquired the land from him. And the 7-mile drive has a lot of different stops along it, including this bridge, which is a sort of covered bridge that they never actually built in Michigan, but it was put in as a form of beautiful, I guess, rustic art almost by Pierce Stocking to make the drive more interesting, and it's still being kept up today. But of course, what most people want to see on the Pierce Stocking Scenic Drive is stop number 9, which is called the Lake Michigan Overlook, where you can overlook Lake Michigan. You can see Lake Michigan very easily by going down this nice boardwalk and seeing the lake. Or you can do it the hard way. And if you've been there, you've probably all seen or possibly been the people who do not pay attention to these signs. The sign says, warning, steep bluff, 450-foot drop. Extremely exhausting, don't throw rocks. And this one's even better. I really hate this sign because what it says is, or the 2 hours it may take to climb back up. And people see that sign and they say, 2 hours? I bet I could do it faster than 2 hours. And then they all do it. And sometimes it does take them 2 hours to get up. So if you're not going to climb down, I don't recommend climbing down. At least go to watch the other people. And actually, this is one of those things where if you have a park radio as a ranger, you'll hear, oh, another emergency, it's stop number 9. And this happens all the time. And people will go and have to be walked out because they can't make it up. So law enforcement or someone else has to climb down to the bottom and then show them how to walk out because they can't make it back up to the top. So yeah, it's not for the faint-hearted. Now, if you are one of the people that climbed down stop number 9 and has had trouble getting back up, you may want to just rest in your tent at one of the 2 campgrounds, Platte River or DH Day. And once you've done that, maybe you'll be ready to go on another hike. So the Empire Bluff Trail is about a mile. It's a very short trail, but it does take you up to a view of the bluffs over the town of Empire. And this is one of the more iconic areas. There's a little boardwalk, and you look out over a beautiful expanse of the bay. There's also the Sleeping Bear Point Trail, which is not as well known. It's down near Glen Haven. It's about 2.5 miles, and if you hike down to this area right here, it's this ghost forest. And that's because the trees get buried as the sand moves. So these were actually pines that were buried as the sand became less stable, and then were later revealed as the sand was blown away, and they are considered to be a ghost forest that you can hike through. It's particularly cool to hike through at night. There's no actual ghosts I'm aware of, but the trees do look pretty spooky. Although you might see some other things. This is a painted turtle that I actually found along the road near the Sleeping Bear Point Trail, and he was in the middle of the road, which is why I picked him up to move him. But you might see some of our friends in the water. Like, this is a great blue heron that I saw from a kayak. There's lots of herons in the area, lots of our leopard frogs. And this is a crab spider. And as you may notice, I like strange animals, so I like the millipedes, I love these spiders. They actually change color to suit whatever they're on, sort of like a chameleon. And so if this were on a green plant, it would have sort of a greenish color. If it were on a brown plant, it would have a brownish color. Here it happens to be a beautiful yellow spider. And we do have our native bumblebees, which help to pollinate the plants. And here's a dusky grouse that was crossing the road in front of my car. Never know what you're going to find out, what you're going to see. Here's a nice damselfly down by the river. And a red fox that happened to be off near the side of my car. So you can see a lot of wildlife. Of course, there are deer, although strangely enough, I didn't see very many. And if you go to the wet areas, you might see the flag iris. There are lots of them. It's beautiful in the spring to kayak in that area. Dutchman's breeches out in the forest. Of course, Jack in the pulpit. There's Jack right there in his pulpit. And trout lily. So a lot of these are the same plants that we would see here in one of our forests that we protect with the Nature Society, including the trillium. This is a blackening wax cap mushroom, which is called that because even though it's this beautiful red, it really looks like that. It looks like a little gnome hat. But if you touch it, it turns black almost immediately. And you can also look for edible fungi. This is a friend of mine who visited and was convinced he was going to find morels because it's a really good area for morels. He didn't find any, but perhaps you will. Look near the base of the old ash trees. It's supposed to be the best place. You can also find a lot of feral apple trees that escape from apple orchards. Some of them are actually old, nearly extinct types of apples that you're not going to taste anywhere else because they no longer are being commercially planted. So it's kind of fun to go out and find all of these wild apple trees and try the apples. You can even go to the asparagus festival. I put this in because it's really funny. It's not technically in the park, it's in Empire, which is where the visitor center is. Yes, this is a man dressed as asparagus. And this is me. I actually won the third place ribbon in the asparagus poetry competition. Thank you, thank you. And you can even get asparagus ice cream. I was waiting for your reaction, that's why I put it in. If asparagus ice cream isn't your thing, you can go and find some Petoskey stones. It's a little better. But remember, if you find them within the park, you can't keep them. So if you want to go up near Northport, you can find them and keep them. These I found in the Lakeshore, and it was so horrible, because I'm like, I'm a park ranger. I can't keep them, and I had to throw them into the lake. But they were nice while they lasted. And you can go fishing. You can actually keep the fish as long as they're not on the list of threatened species or something. And so most of them actually are fish you can keep and eat. And of course, there's always the beautiful sunsets to go and see. This is along the beach in Glen Haven. Even beautiful moon rises. This is over Glen Lake. And after you've watched the beautiful sunset and the beautiful moonrise, you can have a nice campfire with your friends, maybe tell some stories, toast some marshmallows, and then get up in the morning and go on a nice kayak tour, possibly with a friendly and helpful park ranger. They do have tours on the Platte and Crystal Rivers that can be taken with rangers. And this is actually Ranger Peggy doing one of the most popular parts of the Crystal River kayak program, which is shooting the tube. It sounds so exciting. The people that promote this at the kayak rental place have this big sign that says, "Shoot the tube," and it makes it sound like a water park, but you're actually just taking your kayak through a culvert. And you also could look out for some interesting weather. Sometimes we do get extreme storms in that area, like the storm I mentioned earlier. I was not fortunate or unfortunate enough to be there during that big storm in 2015, but I was there during the moderately large storm of 2016. We were in a very small area, enormous hail fell. This is me in front of my house. So this hail, while really cool to look at, you can even see the nucleus where the hail formed. I thought it was fascinating. It wasn't quite so good for my car. But boy, it was pretty neat to see. As long as the weather is good. You can take your bike down the 22-mile pathway that goes in between Port Oneida and Empire. And that's another great way to see the trees, the nature, stop and do some hiking. When you're done riding your bike, you might just want to hang out near the shore for a while and take in the beauty of the sound of the waves lapping against the shore. It's my favorite thing to do. But if you want to be a little bit more adventurous, you can always climb up our famous dune climb. This is the 1970s. Just be aware that if you go to the top, you cannot see Lake Michigan. You can't, it's true. This is Glen Lake. People get to the top and say, "Where's Lake Michigan? Why isn't it here?" It's because you have to hike up and over about another 1.5 miles of sand before you get to Lake Michigan. So if climbing up isn't your thing, you can dig yourself a hole, or you can just stay at the bottom and wait for your kids to come back. So there's a lot of things to do in this beautiful area. And whether you want to look at the water or the forest, if you want to see the flowers or the plants or the wildlife, there's always something to see and something more to explore in Michigan's Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore. There's even a place for history buffs. So if you get a chance, even though most of you have been there, be sure to go back. And we hope that you visit us there very soon. Thank you. Any questions? Yes?
The sand dune that I climbed, I think, was not here. I think it was in, I can't pronounce, I don't know if I'm pronouncing the word right, but Marias, Michigan?
Oh yeah, there's Grand Marais.
It's Grand Marais?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, it's French.
That one, so is that protected?
It is, yeah. So that area, another really big sand dune, it's actually the other area of perched dunes I briefly mentioned. That's up there near our other national lakeshore that's in Michigan, Pictured Rocks National Lakeshore. Yep, and that's the Grand Sable Dunes. And so that is protected within the Pictured Rocks National Lakeshore. There's also 2 other national lakeshores. There's not in Michigan. There's Apostle Islands in Wisconsin, and then Indiana Dunes. But, yeah. Oh, sorry, I thought you were saying something. Yeah, so those dunes that you climbed on are protected, yeah. And there's a beautiful lighthouse up there. I would do a whole separate show on Pictured Rocks if I were going to be here longer, but you know, I think that was long enough. If it was in the 50s, it wouldn't have been protected by the government. That area actually used to be a very active logging area, and the area around Grand Marais, there's an area that is called the Log Slide, and it's an extremely steep dune, even steeper than stop number 9, and people still climb down it. And I actually saw a guy, he sent his kids down, and he had this great big roll of yellow electrical cable. And then he had one of the kids roll it down, and then he was going to haul them up with the cable, and I had to leave before I saw how this went. I still wonder. But it was originally actually a slide for logs. So they would log the pines in the area and then slide them down the steep dunes to the water where they could be more easily moved to the sawmills. And when you were there, it likely still had some of that logging activity, or at least evidence that it had been happening. Really? That's interesting. That whole area was a pretty active logging zone, but I wasn't in Grand Marais in the 50s, so I don't know exactly what it would have looked like. But today it is protected. Any other questions? Yes?
Did you mention how many acres there are in this national park?
I did not. And that's because I don't remember. Just, hold on, I actually prepared for this eventuality. I really did. Right, okay. I really did. I swear. I knew this would happen, and I didn't study it. Park statistics, okay. Other statistics, here you go. Volunteer hours, 71,199 acres. And here's all of your other answers. This is right off the park's website. So about 65 miles of shoreline, 26 inland lakes, 12 miles of rivers and streams, and 908 terrestrial plant species. You can get even more information off of Sleeping Bear's website. When I worked there, I promise you, I actually knew that off the top of my head, but it's been a couple of years. Any other questions? No. You know what's really funny about this picture is that it showed up in the Sleeping Bear Dunes park brochure. The year after I was there, somebody said, "Hey, did you know you're in the Sleeping Bear Dunes park brochure?" And I said, "What? No, I'm not. It must be somebody else." And then they gave it to me, and I was there. I'm actually in it twice. If you look at it, there's a picture of a ranger with their back turned pointing at something, and that's me too. Yeah. It's actually open in the winter, but all of the facilities are closed, and I only worked there during the summer months, which is why I don't have any pictures from that time. But there are ranger tours in the winter, even though the visitor center and the historic museums are all closed. The park rangers do lead snowshoe hikes, and you have to register in advance, and I believe you actually have to bring your own snowshoes. But if you have snowshoes, you can go on a snowshoe hike with the rangers. And it is a popular area for snowshoeing and cross-country skiing, and I would like to go back and do those things. I tried last year, but we didn't have much snow last year, and I kind of missed the proper timing. But many of the trails that are used for hiking during the summer get slightly different usage as cross-country ski and snowshoe trails in the winter. Like the Pure Stocking Scenic Drive, you cannot drive it in the winter. It's not plowed, but you can ski it. Any other questions? Oh, yes. Oh, yeah, so a perch dune is different than a regular sand dune or beach dune because they only exist in places where there's a big bluff made of something that is really soft, like sandstone, that is eroded by the wind. So here we had a tall moraine, or basically a big rock pile of sandstone and limestone, left by the retreating glaciers of the Wisconsin glacier era. And it's actually a really young dune, a really young park. It's only about 20,000 years old or so, which geologically is actually incredibly young. And you have all of the wind wearing down that bluff from the glaciers. And then because the wind is blowing toward the bluff, the wind is coming from the west and blowing toward the east. It wears down the dune, and then that sand blows up and over toward the east. So the bluff gets broken down, the sand blows upward and covers the bluff and makes it look like a 500-foot tall sand dune, when actually only probably the last 100 feet or so is sand. And eventually, because it keeps moving, it will eventually get blown inward so that the dune is no longer sitting on top of the bluff. And when that happens, and technically the dune is now on flat land, not on a moraine, there's a very original name for that. It is called a de-perched dune. And they say that the famous dune climb dune will probably become de-perched within the next century.
You mentioned General Sherman. Did you say something about General Sherman?
No. That was mentioned. General Sherman was actually the name of one of the famous sequoia trees, but similarly, there was an ancient cedar tree that was the biggest cedar tree on the island, which was blown down. And it had a name too, and I'll tell you the truth, I don't know what it was. Unless they named that tree after the famous sequoia General Sherman, which also fell down, I believe. I'm not sure, but I think it did. There's still lots of other sequoias. Now, what I know for certain is that the Sequoia that you used to be able to drive through is no longer there. But I'm not sure about General Sherman. Anything else? All right, well, thank you for coming, and come and visit me at Gila Cliff Dwellings National Monument, New Mexico.